Peace and long life. Why I love Captain Benjamin Sisko. Why I hate Captain Benjamin Sisko. Likely to be an unpopular combination, but I want to explain. Captain Benjamin Lafayette Sisko, incredible Starfleet officer, single father, a very loving father, a strong role model, you name it. The guy who wasn't scared to punch Q, the guy who fights the war with the Dominion, the captain that we probably see make the most hard decisions under the most consistently life-threatening situation. When did we see the Federation at war, especially long-term? Only on Deep Space Nine. And what an incredible job the captain does, and so much that he has to go through to get it done. But we see the setup for this epic conflict. We see the conflict. We see the resolution. In every sort of measurable sense, he is a far stronger, more virile character than Jean-Luc Picard would ever be. He's somewhere more in the vein of James T. Kirk, though he does come across as more cerebral than that. This is the captain you want. Benjamin Sisko is an amazing captain and an amazing character and a great role model and a great Starfleet officer, but Captain Benjamin Sisko is at once a product of and part of the far left move over a span of decades until we arrive at full out woke. I mean, television's been on the left since there's been television. I mean, the people in Hollywood and movies and TV studios have been pushing certain agendas from the beginning. We don't really get a lot of discussion in the Star Trek universe until Deep Space Nine comes about, because the zeitgeist of the liberal leftist communities around Hollywood and the TV and movie studios started to raise this issue of when are you going to have a captain, a lead, a figure who's not white or not male. This was coming up within the culture in some of the nerd magazines, other things. And they kind of made a big deal about, the studio made a big deal about how they had created the name of Benjamin Sisko to be sort of ethnically nondescript, especially the way it's spelled. It could be Latino in the future. It could be somebody white in theory from Spain or some similar. It could be any number. It is a future human. His name gives away really nothing for certain about his race and his appearance. As part of attempting to placate this concept, they set out allegedly to have auditions and try various actors in the role and to select them on their ability to be the captain and not to do what had always been done in the history of theatrical productions back to ancient Greece. By the time you got rid of masks, you had a character in mind and you got someone that looked like the character. Now the beginning of this, let's placate these urges of people. Rather than just admit, you know what, we're going to have a black captain. Like as if they had to finesse it and pretend like, well, it could be anybody. Because honestly, growing up white in a little white town, none of us were bothered by the idea that Captain Sisko would be black. No, nobody. If anything, we were for it. We were all left-leaning enough at that. Nobody in the Star Trek community was going to be like, well, you better make sure that they're the best candidate for the job. No. It was all a ridiculously silly finesse, but we ended up getting Avery Brooks. And I think Avery Brooks brings with him the cultural baggage. He brings with him the timely cultural baggage, and he brings it into Star Trek. There were interviews with him in TV Guide where he talked about how he wanted to be an inspiration to brown children everywhere. The whole optimistic future idea of Star Trek is that we were living in a universe then that was beyond this stuff. this captured very well in the original series. It was being captured very well in Star Trek The Next Generation. But for some reason with DS9, with this character, we had to do this, and we had to make sure that we finessed it like this, and we get this person that wants to talk about it in this way. You'd swear, reading some of his interviews, that you're talking about full out woke and that you're talking about 2018. Relatively early on, there's an episode where Captain Sisko and his son Jake build a replica of an ancient Bajoran spacefaring vessel to prove that they could have reached Cardassia. And it's a cool, one of the better episodes early on. And they have to assemble a hammock in this rough environment because it's not built for comfort. And of course, this is where we get the infamous, where Dad says, "It's hammock time." And son says, "Yo." Yeah, all right, is this a huge deal? No. But again, it's the desperate desire to bring into this future things that are very, very now, and not to reference them in a historical sense. I mean, I grew up on rap music. All white kids in the suburbs in that era did, for the most part. I had nothing against MC Hammer. Are they still going to be listening to MC Hammer in the future? Well, okay, if we're going to be fair, I guess that in 400 years, that's as likely as they're still listening to Beethoven. I don't think that's true, but let's assume that. But that why? Because they happen to be black, they still use the cultural referent to it and assume that they're going to know it that this is what we still do 400 years later because he had a big hit in 1990. I mean, it's an attempt to be cute on camera. I get that. I'm not sure they're really trying to make a profound statement that MC Hammer is still popular among black people in the future. But it drives home this sense that Avery Brooks will bring to this character that he is not a human Starfleet captain in the future of Star Trek, of Gene Roddenberry's imagined future where that stuff doesn't matter. Rather, he is going to be a black man that brings with him the baggage of the 20th century to that role. Whether that's specifically his insertion or not, I suspect that it is based on his interviews and things elsewhere. This is an issue. But this is not nearly as egregious. This is a minor thing. Here's what's egregious. The whole dialogue over Vic Fontaine's holodeck bar. When finally they drag him in, they want to drag the captain to that, there's the huge blow up that they created an historical holodeck, holosuite program set in a time that happened to be segregation in the real world. And he's so mad about that he doesn't want to go to the bar. Now, in their defense, at least Cassidy Yates, his girlfriend, future wife, they have the wherewithal to be like, Benjamin Lafayette Sisko, that was hundreds of years ago, whatever the exact quote is. Like, why the hell are you still upset about this? Which is a good thing to be asking, especially in the context of the Star Trek universe. And you can't fight the feeling that there was a felt need to put that in there. And I can't know it. I kind of suspect, based again on the actor's interviews, that maybe he brought it up. Like, you're really going to bring up a holodeck program based during this time without addressing this. But it's Star Trek. We don't address this because we evolved beyond it. The whole idea of the optimistic future is people are not still walking around feeling mad about something that happened centuries ago and is even then presented as a caricature of itself, focused on this one aspect, not a holistic view of the world at that time. But for Benjamin Sisko, a Starfleet captain 400 years in the future, for him to be outraged about a holodeck program because it's set during a time when there would have been segregation in the real world, he deserved to be chewed out by Cassidy Yates. And there's no reason that had to be part of the story. There's no reason at all, because this is supposed to be the optimistic future of the Star Trek universe. Very late in the series, we get the conflict between the Pa Wraiths and the prophets in the wormhole and the manipulation of Captain Sisko. And we get the fabulous fabulous sequence, and I'm not sure if it's one episode or covers more than one, but we get that fabulous sequence where he is a sci-fi writer in the past, and he's black, and they don't want to publish his story that he wrote about a black man. Now that whole story arc, now that brings up a couple of problems for me. First, it's really well written. It's a great story. This is exactly the sort of things that the Pa Wraiths would evoke to try to, oppress him, pardon the parlance, in order to try to get Benjamin Sisko to, sirens going, to break the spirit of Captain Benjamin Sisko. This is exactly the sort of thing the Pa Wraiths might bring up. Nothing about that feels forced, except it works because it's in the context of the character. The Pa Wraiths know that this makes him mad. The Pa Wraiths know that he still has baggage about this. We knew it over Vic Fontaine's. We've heard it. So it's a very well-written arc in the story, and it really, really works. And it really does that thing that Star Trek does well, that I've mentioned before, bringing the past to the present, to the future, focusing on how we outgrew this stuff. But this becomes something to focus on because Ben Sisko still has hang-ups about it in the 24th century. That's why he takes it personally. Lieutenant Uhura in the original, who's not offended at being called the N-word by Abraham Lincoln. Now, yes, that word is negress, but that was the N-word of his time, effectively. She's not offended because that was a long time ago. Why should that bother me? But the Pa Wraiths, another 100 years in the future, are going to use this on Ben Sisko because they know that it really tears him up inside. This is a very well-written story arc, and it works very well, but it works because our character doesn't really work within the Star Trek universe. At least Ben Sisko is a holdover of a guy that holds grudges from centuries before that Gene Roddenberry didn't want his future to be like, because he didn't want our future to be like that. He wanted us to outgrow it before we got there. And so this ends up being in it. And no one ever within the story, no one ever within that arc asks the logical question, why in a written book did this character, this writer, why did he feel it was necessary to describe the color of the protagonist? I've read tons of great novels that I don't remember if they ever described. I don't know I had an imagination. Sometimes you get a hair color and then you kind of form based on your assumptions what a character looks like. When Charlie Pride first became a big music star, got his record deal, famously, infamously, they left his photo off of his first records because he was black and a country singer, and they weren't sure how people were going to react to that. Now that's not cool. On the other hand, it worked. By the time he had his first live concert and everybody said, who is this guy? And when he started singing, well, that's Charlie Pride. They got around any sort of assumptions about him or any sort of the contemporary prejudices that involve politics and society and economics and everything else. They got around that by making sure that fans heard the music and fell in love with the musician and loved the guy before they met him. And the logical question within the story arc of Captain Sisko as a sci-fi writer in this Pa Wraith created fantasy is, why don't you just write the book and you don't describe him? And once you have a bestseller, once you have a hit, you can do that down the road. Put a picture on the cover art of the book. Maybe you do that eventually, and you do it in the way that ironically Star Trek always did. And that is, you get the people to fall in love with the character. Even though we had diverse characters from the beginning of Star Trek, what Gene Roddenberry did with that was not talk about it. They didn't whine about it. They didn't complain about things from centuries before that evoke all the economics and politics and social stuff going on now, but rather just put them on the screen and let you fall in love with them as lieutenants and ensigns and commanders and your engineers from Scotland and your pilot is from Japan and of course he turns out to be from San Francisco, but that's a long story. But giving us a diverse cast of people and letting us love them as people without constantly harping on the issues of centuries ago. And you better take a stand right now and change your profile picture, if they're doing it today. And you have to jump on the bandwagon on this one issue, or else they didn't do that. They gave us people and allowed us to love people. And then this is how you move beyond this. And he gave us the window into the future where that stuff didn't matter. So it didn't matter. It didn't matter to the plot. It didn't matter to the development of the characters. We learned to love them before we ever thought about them. The first thing you think of, I think any normal person, the first thing you think of when you think of those characters on the original Star Trek isn't what categories they fill. Maybe the woke crowd do, because they look at everything that way. The first thing we think about is them as individuals. That's the first thing. So Captain Sisko, the story arc, maybe Avery Brooks, bringing all of this baggage into Star Trek. And Deep Space Nine was controversial anyway, because it moved even more in the direction than later Next Generation of bringing back in real human foibles and personality conflicts, making it more real. It goes so gritty that Captain Sisko lies and swindles and murders. It partakes in murder just to bring the Romulans into the war. This degeneracy in his character, that's the thing that really stands out as being not Star Trek. He doesn't fit in it time frame wise, his grudges, his being so focused on the past, and then he brings those grudges into the present, and then he's the guy that betrays all the principles of Starfleet just to bring the Romulans into the war. And yeah, that's a great episode, but that's so wrong. I know the question would be asked, well, what would you do? What would Kirk do in that situation? Well, we wouldn't have it. We would write the situation in a way that Kirk would figure out how to get the Romulans to see reason, and they'd all join in a big heroic battle at the end, and you'd live happily ever after without lying and stealing and murdering and dealing with criminals. So it kind of degenerates further and further because of the Captain Sisko story arc, because we have him being this flawed individual, and it ends up being great, entertaining television, but it ends up not really fitting into the Star Trek universe. It's popular enough that I think it ends up damaging future incarnations of Trek. Which I mean, the efforts of Star Trek Enterprise, it was clumsy at the outset. It was getting better when it got canceled. But their attempt to show us developing into that optimistic society that kind of just fell deaf on people that loved the Dominion War, and I did. But we came away with a darker perception and expectation, and we weren't ready to rewind back to any effort at that optimistic future. And it all has that tipping point. But every time I look at it, I love Captain Sisko. I hate Captain Sisko.